Welcome to Lines and Spaces. I'm Jason.
I'm Michaela.
This week we will be discussing the topic of gender inclusive language in the music classroom, and gender inclusivity in music in general. And we are joined by a very special guest today, Dr. Dustin Cates.
Yes, and
Hello.
Dr. Cates is a teacher, a singer, and a researcher, among many other things. His research spans over areas such as diversity, inclusion, and social justice in choral music. He is an active member of the National Association of Music Educators and the American Choral Directors Association, and we are so excited to have him with us today. So, welcome, Dr. Cates.
Hello. It's good to be with you guys.
Dr. K is also a phenomenal professor at Temple. Michaela and I have both had the honor and privilege to work with him and be in, at least for me, one of his classes so far, which has the great experiences in learning from him and the topics that he holds dear has been really influential in my own development. And I would just love to hear a little bit more about you, Dr. Cates, maybe about the research that you've done, maybe some of the other things that you do within the field.
Sure. Well, as Michaela said, I'm on the faculty at Temple, a newer faculty member. I guess I'm 2 years in, although with the pandemic, it doesn't seem like I've been here for 2 years. But before that, I was a teaching fellow at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. In my hometown, I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri. Not to be confused with Kansas City, Kansas. That's not the real Kansas City. Uh, but but in any case, there, while I was working on my PhD, I had a teaching fellowship, so I taught undergraduate music education classes. But my full-time job was the conductor of the Heartland Men's Chorus, which is 150 voice gay men's chorus in Kansas City, which is sort of a strange thing. How is there 150 voice gay men's chorus in Kansas City? But there is. So in any case, I did that for 5 years. Before that, I taught high school choir for 12 years. So that all that means that I'm old. Um, but but when I transitioned from teaching high school choir to going into conducting the gay men's chorus and working on my doctorate, I started to get lots of questions from my previous colleagues who taught school choirs about gender and the variables that go into trying to include students of gender diversity into the choral setting. And my answer immediately was, I have no idea. I have not looked into that and haven't really experienced that very often myself. And so as I was in doctoral work and looking into various things about where I would point my research towards as I finished, I became more interested in this topic and wanted to help out. There are a few researchers in music education who are exploring this area, and so I dug in and added my voice to it, and became very passionate about it. Not only because I didn't feel like I had a lot of the answers, and I don't know if I have all the answers now, but also because of my being a member myself of the LGBTQ community. I felt like this is something I could passionately add my voice to, and also be an advocate for those who are gender diverse. Up front, I should state that I myself am not trans or non-binary, but I'm a fierce advocate for those people. So anyway, that's a little bit about me. So I moved here from Kansas City 2 years ago. Love my time at Temple. I have the most amazing students on the planet. Obviously, you two are included in that, and I continue to try to find ways to ask questions and explore questions that help us become more inclusive music teachers and include more students in the music making process.
Yeah, and then yeah, all very great things. And I kind of like I think it was primarily you who kind of brought up this idea for me at least when I was in your class learning about gender inclusivity and talking about like trans voice change during adolescence and into the future. And I had never actually thought about those topics after even going through the courses at Temple. I was like never like it was always a thing that I like was aware of but never thought about in the educational sense. And through your class that the week that we had learning about it, and also with the article that was that you had published in or put into the PMEA fall edition like magazine, I learned a lot
Mhm.
more about it, and I've been like looking at different research about it just because it is such an important topic, like you mentioned, that isn't really touched on a lot, even in like the pre-service stage. Like you might like hear about it, but if you don't actually seek it out or like go look through the research or have like a specific professor who you can like look at or like has talked about it, you kind of don't get to like fully experience it unless you yourself in the music classroom are working with students who are transgender or non-binary of the sort.
Yeah, I think that your experience probably isn't much different, at least from what the research that I've done, from other undergraduate music education students in universities across the country and those who are now in service teachers. Um, Many of them say, this is not a topic that was ever addressed in my curriculum, and so I'm thinking that it's something that we should begin to include, and so that's why I'm passionate about it as well. So I think it's certainly something that we need to, as teachers of future music educators, include into your
Hmm.
experience.
But well, let's actually get started into. So I kind of want to just like just for people who aren't familiar with like the terms and whatnot, like just like a short like not definition, but like a understanding of what exactly is gender inclusive language, just in like the general sense.
Sure. Um, well, I think the I'll try to give a short answer to that, but I think in general, um, this idea of gender inclusive language is a small snapshot of a larger topic, right? Which would be maybe 5 podcasts, but I think, and we don't have that time, but I think gender inclusive language is the teacher language, the communication, informal and formal communication that we as music teachers use to communicate with our students, with our parents, with our larger community, the school community, the administration, all those sorts of things, both in writing and in spoken word. How do we communicate in ways that increase inclusivity or inclusion of specifically of students who are gender diverse? In research, we sometimes go, we're going to say that we're going to use the term transgender, but when we say transgender, we mean students who are non-binary, students who are gender fluid, and those are all terms that may or may not be familiar with people who are listening. But I think in general, the surface level understanding is that um, these individuals do not have a gender identity that would align with what we would say is this traditional notion of male or female, and that is the only choice. Or they are born with the sex or gender of a specific, I shouldn't use the word gender because gender is the term that we're defining as this idea of maybe you were born with parts that wouldn't normally identify as a male or female, but it might differ. You know what I'm trying to say here?
Yeah.
And so, in any
Yes.
case, I think I lost my train of thought. Sorry. We're moving away from that for sure. But I think how then do we begin to, as teachers, change the way that we function in ways that are more inclusive? And in this particular conversation, we're talking about how does that happen with the use of language. And so what changes, both large and small, can I begin to make that don't make my students feel excluded when I ask them to do things like line up at the door in one line of boys or one line of girls? Or if I say to the tenors, guys, please stand up. What if all tenors aren't guys? Or flutes, come on, ladies, play that B flat in tune. Well, what if all flutes aren't, I mean, and I think in the world of choral music, I think there are maybe even more opportunities to misgender and genderize things because we have this deep association with voice part and gender. But I think it spans from elementary school music teachers, children's choirs, bands, orchestras, all kinds of things. There's gender all over the place. I mean, there's a ton of research even before this idea of gender inclusivity was something that was top of mind. about the association with instruments and
Hmm.
the human beings that play them. Like I just used the flute for example. We know that most people say flute is a feminine instrument. What does that mean, right?
Yeah.
And so I think, how do we begin? Big idea. How do we begin to say, first of all, we made all that stuff up, right? So those are society's impositions of these ideas on the world, and because we made all that stuff up, we can undo it and do it better. I think Maya Angelou says, when we know better, we do better. And I think this is exactly what we're talking about right here. We know better. We know that all tenors aren't always guys, and we know that all flute players aren't always ladies, or whatever that means. And so I think we need to begin to examine what we do and what we say, and how we can begin to open that up to be more inclusive of all people.
Yeah, I know we kind of discussed before just the how simple it is to just change some of your language, and that's so important in so many aspects, especially here. And as an educator, as a teacher, it's our job to make sure all of our students are feeling like they're in an environment where they could be learning, an environment they're safe in. So doing something as small as changing your language to make sure everybody feels included is, in the big scheme, it's such a small change, but it makes such a difference.
Hmm. And I think what my own research says is that um, those teachers who have begun to change their teaching practices to be more gender inclusive, or inclusive of gender diversity, say the first thing I did was begin to change my language, and that was the easiest thing. And then my research also said the first thing that I did was I began to change my language, and that was the hardest thing. And so, and in many ways that makes plenty of sense, right? Because what the language that we use is habitual. We develop habits based on muscle memory and synapses that connect in the brain and all those kinds of things. And then they're hard habits to break. It's like smoking or anything like that. And so we begin to have to examine, well, wait, I got to stop saying guys when I'm asking the choir to stand up, because that might exclude somebody. And it might even mean that it's not a big deal, or at least they're not saying it's a big deal to the choir, but it's not really a question of, is it a big deal to the choir? It's a question of, is it the right thing to do? It's not even a question of, do I have a trans player or singer in my ensemble? Is it the right thing to do? We could change the label from trans to, I don't know, come up with any other cultural experience or race, and we don't do that with those things either. We say we strip away this idea of these are the only identifiers for our people, our students, and we create a more universal approach to how we teach. And I think that that's the heart of what we're talking about. So there are all of these bigger kinds of schools of thought, like universal design for learning and multicultural education and culturally responsive teaching. They're all like interwoven into this thing. But I think it gets tricky when you begin to talk about those things, because some people approach those as like a catch-all. Well, if I do this, then I don't really have to dig in and know much about trans singers, because I am open and affirming of all singers. So I'm not going to specifically worry about who you are as a human being, because I treat everybody the same. No one should ever fall into that trap,
Hmm.
because it's not a good one to do, because then you 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 are turned away from your responsibility as a teacher, which the most important thing, we know this, the most important thing is that I as a teacher develop a personal relationship with the students that I have in my classroom. I know their names, I know things about them, I care about the things about them, I ask them about those things, and then that informs how I teach them. And so really that's probably even the most important element in all of this, is that we develop those relationships with our students, and then that informs how we interact with them. And then the other stuff, what I know about the implications of taking testosterone on the birth assigned female voice, those kinds of things can also inform that. And then we're even more informed, but the center of it is the relationship with the student that I develop, for sure.
That's like a very important thing that we've talked about like a lot on this podcast, is the idea of like care and like how you create your environment in the classroom to make sure that all students feel like that they can be open and be accepting of others in that space. And you brought up the idea of multicultural education and how like and also universal design is like a catch-all type of thing. Like if I do this, then I'll be fine because I've implemented all this stuff in my classroom, and that is like a very it's like a really it's a good thing to have to design your lessons and to have your classroom reduce prejudice reduction and like empower like the school culture in general by having all those things in place. But it is still it comes down to like how you individually like relate to every student, and I think one of like the easiest ways to get like the ball rolling is how you introduce yourself in the classroom. Like nowadays,
Yeah.
I try to always say like, "Oh, hello, mom. Mr. Wu," or I'll say my full name depending on like the who I'm teaching, and be like, my pronouns are he, him, his." Just like I build that like relationship. Like I'm opening up, I'm saying who I am, and hopefully that invites you to also as well introduce yourself in a way so I understand.
hmm Yeah, I think there are little small things to agree with Michaela. There are little small things that you can begin to do that begin to snowball into larger things, like I'm changing my concert attire policy. When we compare how difficult it is to change our language to how easy it is to like just rewrite that paragraph in the choir handbook or something like that, then I mean that we may find that that policy change is maybe a little bit easier if we're in charge of the policy and we don't get pushback from our administration or community or something like that. But in this case, I think yes, I can publicly state up front that I value you knowing the pronouns that I use.
Hmm.
That says to every single student or whomever you're talking to, if it's back to school night and it's the parents, that says to every single human that you're speaking to that you care about that, you value that. I think one thing that we should begin to also unpack is that what happens if somebody doesn't want to share their pronouns? I think that that's something that we need to think about. I think it's okay to not want to. I think it's also okay to have an individual conversation. If you feel like you're misgendering somebody, I want to make sure I'm not misgendering you. Those kinds of things. They're very delicate. You have to handle them with care. I think the relationship that you're building also helps you as a teacher. But I do think there are little small things, like you said, like here are my pronouns on day one. Not taking attendance out loud on the first day, having everybody do the little traditional note card or something like that. Those are things that, so you don't have to say out loud in front of everybody if I don't want to publicly share my pronouns. So I think a little bit of forethought with this idea of gender inclusive language or gender inclusivity in general in mind. And you can avoid both uncomfortable situations, but also send the message loud and clear without even saying it to your students that this is something that you value and something that is going to continue to be important to you along the way.
Hmm. And kind of just like I know that you had mentioned also the larger implications with it that like gender inclusive language that learning in general kind of falls all within different type of categories as well, like culturally responsive teaching or culturally
Yeah.
responsive pedagogy. Would
Mhm.
you mind like exploring just how they're connected just a little bit?
Sure. So I think all of those uh, social justice oriented, inclusive pedagogies, I guess you might call them that, or it's just or approaches to teaching, I think are aimed towards um, both enriching the learning experiences of students who are otherwise marginalized, but also creating richer, more diverse, more inclusive experiences for students who aren't marginalized, and then also changing the way that we think about things, right? So if I begin to say my pronouns as the teacher, even the cisgender Caucasian white dude, which I am myself, um, is a part of that experience and is impacted by the discussion and the value in a positive way, if you ask me. And I think if you ask most folks. And so that also begins to have a positive impact and lifts everybody up. I think that that's an important part of this idea of being inclusive and responsive to culture and sexuality and gender. But these pedagogies that we're talking about, multicultural education, culturally responsive teaching, culturally responsive pedagogy, universal design for learning, social and emotional learning, all of these kinds of, they're either areas of study or approaches that you might use as a teacher, aim toward that. And I think gender inclusivity, gender inclusive language rather, is like probably step one in some of those pedagogies and some of those ways that you respond to students and the ways that you plan your learning and design your classrooms and those sorts of things. And so, but at the center of all those, I think even before step one is this idea of a relationship with your students, empathizing with your students. They that particularly those that don't have the same lived experiences as you. Um, if I'm doing this just because somebody told me to, it's probably not going to be an authentic representation of myself as a teacher. And so that's why I say go back to this. Are you building a relationship with your students? And is that the motivation for wanting to be more inclusive? Because if it's not, you have your own work to do before you begin to start like changing. I guess I could say it's probably do it, do it because it's good. You're keeping your classroom open and inclusive of more people is always a good thing. But I think your motivation behind it is really important. And I think it should be centered at developing this relationship with your students and and increasing your cultural competence and all those kinds of things for sure.
Yeah, that's something that I know Jason and I have definitely talked a lot about, and is something that we find very important, and I think a lot of people do, is the importance of just being motivated by caring for the students and wanting to make sure that they are developing as human beings. And as important as the subject matter is, the subject matter cannot be learned without the real relationship or without giving the students a reason to want to learn or to care and feeling valued.
Yeah, I mean, how much more impactful? I mean, in music education, we don't always make our students read chapters, those kinds of things. But you're exploring the meaning behind a given piece, the text, the composer, and that's hard work. That sometimes isn't the most enjoyable thing. But when you're in relationship with other humans, and this is the community's goal, is to understand more about whomever, whatever composer you're looking at, or whatever piece you're looking at, or how are we going to perform this so it's makes the most difference, right? Music that makes a difference, kind of thing. How is it going to be the most moving? How am I going to be the most vulnerable musician as I do it? Then the fact that we're in a relationship builds that kind of toward that common goal, I think even better. It makes it more meaningful in the long run too. I mean, we see that when the seniors have their last concert, and how moved they are by the experience, all those kinds of things I think are part of the music education experience, the ensemble experience that we have in our secondary schools, that really point us towards the relationship as the center point. But I think how we care for that relationship is really important, and doing what we've always done doesn't always meet the mark. I think if we look through the history of education in our country and the history of music education, we're always moving towards including more people in what we do. We don't always do the best job of it. I think we are beginning even now, specifically in regard to race, to examine like, well, wait a second, there are people who are under or or not even represented in this music making process that we need to begin to examine even more. And so I think that's a good thing, but we also need to get ahead of it a little bit more, because we think after a while we've learned like, wait a second, there are some things we can do to just fling open the doors to be more inclusive. So let's hope we can begin to do that even more.
Yeah, and I completely agree with all those things. Like it's such an important topic to just like start including more and more people within the classroom. And going off of that, like what are some things we talked about a little bit earlier about like let's say like you were like a day one music teacher or a music teacher who's been in like the field for a very long time, using like the heretical like rhetoric or like the usage of language that they've been using since when they were educated, it was a little bit different than how we presently are being educated and how to communicate. Like, what are some like easy ways to like start transitioning into a more gender inclusive, like in classroom environment through language?
Sure. I think first of all, I should say that I don't consider myself somebody who's successful at it all the time. I mentioned I taught high school for 12 years, and I was just as guilty as the next person to say something like, ladies, please stand. Or when I was talking to tenors or basses, guys, do this. Or sing a little bit more macho. What does that, you know, I mean, there are certainly things that I feel like are stains on stains on my credibility as it relates to this issue that I would go back and I would never say again. But I think that also is the center of this idea of, wait a second, you don't always have to get it right, but you have to try to get it right. And so
Mm,
that's what I'm hoping to do. But whether you're a pre-service teacher getting ready to go into an amazing, fulfilling career as a music educator, or an in-service teacher who has some set and established ways of doing things and saying things, I think it centers around this idea of the behavior, because that's the language that I use is the behavior, and so then I have to identify what it is, you know, that I'm saying that I want to change, and so start with one thing. Don't start with all of it, because there's a mountain then to take care of. But monitoring that, so how you can choose how you want to do that. I think we could use the example of like actually this is something I'm personally working on. I'm not including the entire community yet. And so I, as the teacher, maybe you record your lessons, maybe you don't, but I have a handful of pennies and I put them in one pocket as I'm teaching. Maybe one day when we can actually teach in the classroom again. um, and as I teach and I notice that I say guys or girls or ladies or anything else that might have to, you know, that genderizes the instruction, I take a penny from one hand and then move it in my other pocket, and nobody knows the difference. I mean, we recommend doing those kinds of things just as we want to change teacher behaviors or any kind of behavior, frankly. I mean, you could be in the board chair of an organization in the boardroom, or you could be teaching in the music classroom. This idea of self-shaping kind of comes from this book called Teaching Discipline, which is a really important book in music education by a really important researcher named Cliff Madsen, who is the teacher of a million great music educators. And so he proposes correctly that we can do things that based on a behavioral approach to change what we do. And so set yourself up for success by thinking through what you're trying to change, and then give yourself some sort of way to check it. And some would say, and give yourself a reward when you do it right, and don't when you don't. And then that could be what the pennies are. I think another way to do it is to involve the entire classroom. And so you establish out front that this is an important thing and have a discussion about why, and then students are sort of involved and on board, and you say we're going to start with trying to change the language that we use. And so first of all, you know, level base, we don't say anything that's hurtful to anybody, and that if somebody does say something that's hurtful, we'll assume that they didn't intentionally do that, but we'll also let them know that that was hurtful to me, those kinds of things. But you know, when the class is sitting in front of you and you use that language and you give them permission to go like, wait, you said guys, and you go like, yes, you're right, I did, I'm sorry, let me write that on the board. Those kinds of things, I think, might even be more successful, because then everybody's accountable and everybody's trying to do it. And then when you make the other changes to policies or procedures, it becomes a little bit easier too, because it's just a logical next step to what you're trying to do to be more inclusive of people. I think maybe, why are we focusing only on gender? Somebody may ask that question, and you say one step at a time, or maybe you focus on a couple of other things as well, to, you know, include more composers of color into your lessons. Those kinds of things might represent a larger aim toward inclusivity of all kinds of diversities.
yeah, and like you said, it is such like a large encapsulating like idea, like gender inclusivity, that they're all subjects that have their own like mountains of like information and like resources and stories to unpack. And that's why like even within this podcast that we have, it's within like the like hour-ish time span that we have, it's so difficult to like touch on all the things that we want to touch on, which is why I kind of wanted to use this podcast as like creating that like the this like not like a guideline, but like like a centered like foundational idea you can start people can start chewing on, like thinking about as they get back into teaching after I guess most people are on break right now. So
Yeah,
hopefully,
I think all of well, everything that we do as a teacher, as teachers, um, is going to be this balance between particularly, sorry, I'm talking over myself, particularly with ensembles that are gigantic. I mean, marching band is huge, right?
mhm.
So wait a second, you want me to develop an individual relationship with every single person in the marching band? Absolutely. Absolutely.
Mhm.
And it's more important probably than anything. It's more important than them playing in tune, because I'd propose that they're probably going to play in tune if you develop a relationship with them, or at least they're going to work on it a little bit harder.
Yeah.
But in any case, I think it's always the balance of generalizing and then specific guising. That's not really a word, but the general and the specific, I think you have to find the balance. And I think so the generalizing is we move way back and we talk about culturally responsive teaching, but it also has an impact on the specific. And so our cultural competence, what we know about the implications of estrogen on the birth assigned male voice pre puberty, those kinds of things. It's important for us to have an understanding of those, particularly as a choral conductor. But it's also important for us to begin with the approach of, okay, let me open this way up. If I don't have that knowledge yet, I know it's going to be important for me to get it, and I'm going to
Mhm.
zoom in and focus on those issues. But we also then begin with the general and finding the balance between those two as we move towards trying to be more culturally competent for our students.
Yeah, and something that I want to touch on something also is this idea of like you said like planning ahead, like doing like the whole like writing tallying yourself like how you did and having the students interact with you, like oh you said guys type of thing. And also like I think another way to something that I've also been working on is like within like your own curriculum, like when you're if you have the chance to like build your own curriculum, like write lesson plans, it's just like writing, not scripting yourself, but like writing in like in your lesson plan you practice, especially in our cases. Michaela and I are still doing the pre-service teaching where we teach like small chunks of class and we submit lesson plans, which you probably wouldn't normally do in like a actual teaching environment where you submit like a daily lesson plan in to get
You
graded.
might, you might,
Yeah, yeah.
depending on your school and your principal, you actually may, which is one of the reasons we work so hard on it.
Yeah, no, it's definitely developed like great skills writing it and like making it so that it feels like natural. It's like whenever I script myself or like whenever I do the procedures, I always write in like a quotation mark like what I might say in that situation, and I always make sure
Hmm.
that when I double check it, I like there's no assumed gender or like assumed like race type of thing within it. Nothing is assumed type of thing.
Yeah, I think it's an easy categorization, right? Boys and girls. And it's something that when we're trying to divide people that we, without the forethought of planning it, might do. And I think this is where the planning comes in, the lesson planning comes in, is that we don't accidentally or without much thought revert to that. Boys line up, girls line up. Well, why? Why couldn't you use birthdays or something else? And so I think you're exactly right. But also, when you zoom in and you say, I say guys a lot, what can I change? So pick a word to substitute for that. I never used the word folks before, but I use that all the time now, right? And it sounded kind of weird to me, but now it's just like second nature. Or, choir or band. Saying that like band, will you please, la 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 la, seemed weird until I finally kind of, it fell in. I don't say band because I don't teach band very often or ever. But hey, choir, please, la 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 on la la la. That's an easy substitute for guys. Could you do la, 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 which we wouldn't say could you do because that's a rhetorical question we don't really want them to answer, and we would never do that either. But in any case, I think yeah, planning it ahead, and one of the things in parenting and in teaching, we sometimes plan the failure, not in a good, like we want you to fail, but like here's this opportunity because we know when we fail, we learn, right?
Mhm.
And so we zoom in and plan these opportunities where if I say guys, I'm immediately going to say folks instead, those kinds of things.
Yeah, I had like a kind of an experience with that was for me like the term that I like you said folks, you used it a lot, and I kind of use the word like friends because I had a marching instructor, like a brass tech back in my high school, who would call us friendos. Like he's like, "Hey friendos, let's get started." And it was kind of like a funny way of saying it, but like I didn't realize until I was thinking about like a year ago when I started learning about this topic was like, that's a great word. Like that doesn't assume anything. You're kind of building this like relationship already, just using the word like friend or like a play on the word, and there's no assumed gender in that terminology. So when I started teaching, like as funny as you said, like marching band and trying to learn everybody's names, like that was my goal number one. Was like I have to first learn my section's name that I'm working with primarily, and then the brass section, and then the larger band at large, because I want to make sure that if I have to give instructions to somebody, that I can at least say their name, or like or even say like, "Hey friends," or like I'll normally just say friends or like friendos. Let's get started. Blah 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 blah. Just because it's such a I want to say easy change, but it's like such like a small thing that you can just start using, like you said, the replacing language or like giving yourself like a list of words to start replacing language with is like a good like step in like the right direction.
Yeah, I think something that we this is sort of like leans into another topic, but um, as music educators, as teachers, we are like the principal of a small school in many cases. I mean, if you think about the number of students that are in a given music program at a large high school, there's a lot of kids. That's a small elementary school. And so when we think of it in those terms, we're we're like the administrator, right? We have to make some decisions that impact the overall culture of the program, and this idea of inclusive language is one of them. I have had this experience now, particularly when it's something that I'm now that I'm more intentionally focused on it. When I invite somebody in to speak to my ensemble or even my classes, um, when those individuals who I invite in don't use language that's inclusive of gender or other kinds of things, my students notice it. It's something that we talk about afterwards. Like I noticed that they kept saying, and I think that that's when you know you're headed in the right direction because you've changed the culture of that community that gathers on Mondays and Wednesdays at 1 p.m. or whatever it is. And I think that's a little sign you can look for is that do your students really notice this? That means that it's impacting who they are inside their DNA, right, in their ears, and
Mhm.
they're recognizing it. I think it's something that's important to look for sure.
And like I kind of want to, since we kind of like define most of like the things that we like the baseline type of things, and like looking since this podcast is called Lines and Spaces, like we built that kind of that foundation on like the line that we've made. I want to kind of like expand outwards like to like the space and what this topic itself could include in like the larger sense. And like you had mentioned before, a lot of it does tie back to some of the older philosophies that we've had learned, like multicultural education and culture responsive teaching and whatnot. And one of the things that you had mentioned it was like why are we just talking about gender? And you had brought up about like introducing composers and like different musicians of color or of different gender identity within your classroom, that representation. And this is a topic that I as like a hopefully future band director, there is a lot of repertoire, much like in choir, that like always kind of like you lean on to learn about and like that you use in your classroom. And like I was thinking back to like my upbringing as a student in band class instrumentalist and the music that we looked at, and a lot of the times like that music was just the same composers. You see Robert Smith, you see a lot of these like predominantly white male composers in like the band realm, Philip Sousa, in like the march sense and whatnot. And I was just trying to think about like composers outside of that range, because this idea of representation is so important that like students have to see themselves in action, like someone that they can align with themselves in action, to be like, oh, if so and so is doing that and like they kind of look like me, they have like the same type of identities to me, then maybe I'll be able to succeed in that field as well. Like I know growing up, being an Asian American, I hardly saw Asian composers, and that to me was like one of like the hardest things, was like, could I really be a music educator? I don't normally see Asian American educators in the U.S. Like even just with my upbringing through it. And I think with the same idea with like gender inclusivity, if you're a transgender individual and or non-binary, like you're playing this music by like Mozart or like Beethoven, but they don't really relate to you in that same like way. You don't have like a direct connection with them. And I kind of just wanted to talk about that topic of like representation, like the importance of it.
Yeah, I think something that is at the center of every single one of those social justice oriented pedagogies that we were talking about, gender, culturally responsive teaching, culturally responsive pedagogy, multicultural education, all of those things is representation in the curriculum. I mean, that's huge. If I don't see myself represented in the I don't see myself as important enough to be represented in the curriculum, then I don't feel a sense of being included. I think so. First of all, that's basic. We need to be including the diverse composers and diverse content and topics that celebrate diversities into what we do as music teachers, and not just on Black History Month, or June is Pride Month, so it's difficult for us to do that as teachers because we're not usually in session at that moment. But I do think we also can take a hard look at the history of the things that we're doing, because it's not always so straight, to put it bluntly. Like I think there is a line of research that looks at the gender and sexuality of many of the composers that we hold dear to us, like Handel, for instance. And there's some questions about whether or not Handel was a straight old white guy or a gay old white guy. And so I think at least stating those questions could be something that's helpful, and that is uplifting to a student that might want to see themselves in the music. But it's also important for us to look at contemporary composers who also are establishing themselves as, in this particular case, we're talking about gender or sexuality. And I think that becomes even more of a challenge, because we then, as a teacher, don't want to out someone who doesn't want to be outed or identified as the trans composer or whatever the case may be. But I think there are some composers or leaders in music that have established themselves as that's something that's important to them. And I think then that's something that we should share with our students. Or something that we set them up to discover themselves. If we're if I'm a straight cisgender white band director and I'm not incredibly comfortable discussing the topic, I would say you should probably become a little bit more comfortable with it, because it's just something that you should be talking about, because your students should be represented in the things that you say. But you can also have them discover that on your own, and then as a result, that leads to the discussion. But I think it's, for sure, we should be creating these experiences that don't just shine a light on what we've always done, but what we should be doing. And I think that doesn't negate the importance of what's happened in the past, right? So know better, do better. Well, it still might be a great arrangement by that standard bearer band arranger. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it anymore. It just means that we shouldn't only do that, right? And so there's nothing inherently wrong with being a straight white band composer or arranger, right? It's when as the teacher, I only select those arrangements. I mean, there are other questions about cultural appropriation and those kinds of things, which is another different podcast. But I think what's just starting with this idea of the general and into the specific. Let's just take an inventory of the diversity that we're presenting in the curriculum and the music that we offer our students. That's another starting point to begin to make transformational change for inclusivity in our classrooms.
Are there any I'm just curious, just since we're talking about the kind of like the things that we are moving away from like the general topic that we were talking about earlier, like what are some things like beyond that you may personally think about, like just looking beyond, like what's that next step, like after like you set the language, you made the environment, like what are some next steps that you can think of in that process?
Well, so I think one of the things that my advisor and teacher and mentor, Charles Robinson, would say to undergraduate music education students was, who decides who decides? He would ask teachers that, right? Who decides who decides? The ultimate answer is that you decide who decides. You're the teacher, and as the teacher, you're the leader. And so you have to make these important decisions. Now, that doesn't mean you're a dictator and nobody else has a say, but you decide who decides, and then make sure that what you decide is inclusive and aims us toward that. And so I think we begin to establish policies and procedures and language that we use. That's something that we immediately do. And then we include the community in a discussion, particularly if it's a change. Like, so you establish, I'm going to change the language that I use, and then we're going to look at the policies that we have and go like, okay, concert attire. Here's a good example. Temple choirs has made a change in our concert attire, and it wasn't something that Dr. Reardon, Dr. Ndaya Hart, Dr. Dilworth, Dr. Shannon, and myself just sat around a table and decided on our own. We established both with this community of singers and with the community of leaders that this is an important thing to us. And now let's have a discussion about how we can best, based on what we know, how can we best facilitate a change that is more inclusive of all people? And that kind of discussion then has implications for other things besides concert attire, because then we're examining the way that we do things and how we can have an impact on what trips we decide to take, or what we call our ensembles, or those kinds of things. All then begin to one thing then begins to have an impact on the other. But as the teacher, you decide who decides, right? And so you pick that we're going to address this issue, not an uninformed decision, but because you can take all the research that's happened and clearly establish that this is something that is very important. But I think they all begin to have an impact on each other. But including the community in the discussion is center to it. Otherwise, it's you, the dictator, which is not the way to run things at all.
And I completely agree. And oh, sorry, Michaela.
Oh no, I was just going to say that's really helpful. That's going to stick with me, that you decide who decides. That's especially transitioning from the student side to the teacher side of things, which I know Jason and I are going through right now.
Yeah.
That's very helpful.
Well, I think, and one of the things that he would always say, that Charles Robinson, good guy, you should know him, by the way, amazing teacher. But things like, what's the setup of the classroom? Who's going to decide that? You are, right? If nobody decides where the chairs are going to go, or if there are even going to be chairs, and why there should be chairs if there are chairs. I mean, there are all these decisions to make that are solely sitting on your shoulders as the teacher, and it can be overwhelming, but it's also really important. So if I decide that there are chairs, how am I going to decide where they're sitting, right? And I better not choose boys on one side and girls on the other. Those kinds of things are all really important as the teacher. And then that goes, then we can take it back to the culturally responsive teaching or the multicultural education, in that you've established me, music education professor, as the decider, but my decisions have to be informed by something. And that's my cultural competence is one of those things. The fact that I know that whether or not I have a gender diverse student in my classroom, that is the right thing to do to use gender inclusive language, is really important, and that should inform my decision making for sure.
And like the term that you bring up a lot, and also the thing that I, after reading through the article, is like know better, do better. And I want to just like that term just like really stuck with me reading it. I was like, yeah, like that's like one of that's something that we always want to do, is like if you get more research and more information into like that you read, you should try to like think about like, oh well, how can I start to implement some of those things that research has come out, especially recent research that has come out about how I can include that within my own teaching or my own classroom environment. And it's like that, like you said, it's okay like that we make mistakes, you trip up, because especially with any new type of thing, you will make mistakes, like we've learned. But just getting back, like okay, I did this, that, and that. I had to make sure that I try to continue moving forwards with what I'm trying to do, and including more research and being informed whenever I try to make changes.
Yeah, so I think the knowing better and doing better part, you could also say it differently. Like, I think particularly as musicians and artists, we sometimes develop these strong opinions about the way things should be or the way things are. And then when something butts up against that, it's difficult for us to unpack. And I think what's wrong with being better every single day? the thing that's hard about it is that we have to keep learning, right? We have to keep going like, oh, wait, the world isn't exactly how I decided it was. So that's okay, because when we know better, we do better. We're more inclusive of other people. So one of my, I'm like a, I love Brene Brown, and she says in her head when she's having difficult conversations or interacting with difficult decision making, she says, I don't want to just, I'm not trying to be right. I'm trying to get it right. And so getting it right is way different than trying to be right. Be right is a static, like, I've decided it's this way and I'm not budging, you know? And I don't know that there are many topics or situations that we're going to encounter as teachers that it's a good idea to just go like, I'm not moving. So trying to get it right is certainly an approach that I try to endorse for sure.
I mean, with the field and everything, it's things are constantly changing. New information is constantly like coming in, and especially we're realizing now in the with the pandemic going on, like things are like rapidly coming up. Like, oh, how do you teach a Zoom class better, or like an online class better, or like what resources do we have? Because like I'm on a lot of like Facebook groups and forums that talk like a lot of teachers feel like overwhelmed with like everything going on, and I think it is such since it is so different than what we were used to doing with how because we're no longer most of us are no longer like in person teaching like a live class, especially with the with our subjects in music. It is such a it's a very difficult thing to be in a very difficult position to have to like change up your curriculum or like try to find those resources and whatnot. And I feel like this pandemic period has allowed us to kind of open up a lot of those the can of worms that we never had to deal with because we always had that classroom experience. Like I was talking to one of my co-op teachers for my upcoming student teaching, and he had talked a lot about like the stuff that he learned over the pandemic and like the new information that came up, and how like before like he never even thought about it because nobody was like worried about like going on the idea of like gender of like that the home environment like sometimes like students aren't comfortable in their home environment because they can't be open about who they like are within their home environment, and like they come to school and they're able to express themselves because the teacher has created that environment for them. And then now that the student is 100% just kind of at home within that environment and they can't express themselves like they want to. He had brought up like that it's that change of character, and he's thinking about
Mhm.
like how can I make it so that all students even within this home environment can continue to be creative, continue to express themselves how they want to be. So that's like one takeaway that like I've kind of gained from this pandemic is like some like the older things now are being opened up as like maybe not the best things to use or like best things to do.
Yeah, I think how is this? How can we be proactive and emerge as something better than we did when we went in is a real challenge. Hold on one second. I think I'm losing my. Let me hold on one second. Sorry, let me get it. It'll be better.
You're still muted.
How about now?
All good.
Oh, sorry. Those earbuds. I need to get new ones. They're dying in the middle of the thing. But I think how can we emerge, particularly with this time, without having a lot of in-person music making, or it at least looks different than it did before. How can we emerge better and more thoughtful? But there's also a real concern about the social and emotional needs of many of our students, like you mentioned, Jason, because I think we sometimes take for granted and sometimes don't realize, unless we're really thoughtful about it, that our rooms are home for some people. Not just LGBTQ kids, but all kinds of people who are coming to have their soul filled by what's happening. They want to be intellectually stimulated and make moving music, but it's also a place of comfort for them to be, and they feel a sense of community and belonging there. And without having that opportunity, it can be really dangerous. And so I think um, how then do we as teachers begin to create a sense of community in this online space, or without being able to shake each student's hand at the door or those kinds of things, is something that we really do have to thoughtfully consider. I think hopefully we're at the last leg of this, being socially distant and in some cases not being able to meet as an ensemble in person. But I think what then can we do to be more thoughtful about the music making when we are in person, right?
Mhm.
I know for me, for sure, I'm going to value that. I mean, I hope as a teacher that I always establish with my students that I value the interpersonal contact and communication and knowing of my students, but it's going to be even more important to me. I know it because I miss them. I miss, shaking their hands and saying hello and getting to know them as I did previously. I mean, I do the best I can on Zoom, but it's not the same by any means. But then how can we take this experience and turn it into something that makes our music teaching more meaningful?
Um, there's something that I'm curious if you would. I know that before we had set up this podcast and stuff, we had met before about like the topic itself, and there was one story that you told Michaela and I about your son in school about like the use of like crayons and colors in
Yeah,
transition. I don't know if you like if you feel comfortable sharing that to like
sure,
the live
sure.
audience, but it's such an impactful story.
Absolutely. So he's now 9 years old. So he's almost double digits, as he would say. Um, but when he was in kindergarten, the first week of school, he went and I picked him up and dropped him off from school back then. And I picked him up, and we would always talk about, what was the best thing that happened today, and were there any bad things that happened today, happies and crappies, as we call them. And he said, well, I was coloring at the table today with Dante, and I was using a pink marker. And he was like, amazed, boys don't use pink markers. And I said, oh, and as my teacher brain kicks in, I'm like, oh, well, what did you say back to him? And he said, well, I told him that I felt sorry for him because I get to use all the markers. And, as a teacher and researcher of inclusivity and that kind of thing, I was like, yeah, that's the right thing to say. And I think it's something that, sort of is a lesson for all of us in that, who cares what color marker you use, right? The technique with which you use that marker and the purposes for which you use that marker are way more important than the color of the marker. And so, like, know better, do better, what's really important, all of these adages, I think are the general thing that have something to do with the specific thing. But he teaches me stuff every day. I mean, and man, I probably didn't even teach him that. He probably But I think something that, speaking of things that teach us, you guys have heard this before, but I think it's something that bears repeating, particularly for those people who haven't heard it yet. The sort of guiding philosophy of and I think I've established this probably multiple times during the podcast, my guiding philosophy is that I want to be a leader, teacher, carer, lifter up of people, right? And I love and am passionate about music. And so that's the vehicle through which I try to do that, loving and caring and lifting up and developing relationships with. But I think when we get those mixed up, then sometimes I think our priorities are out of whack. And I think I learned that most. I mentioned Charles Robinson. He was one of my, one of my mentors and most important people in my professional career and maybe even personal too. But equally important is one of my choral directors in college, who I still am in communication with. And he's like, if there was a Santa Claus of choir directors, it is this guy. He's amazing, except he's real. If there are kids, but his name is Eve Ely, and he would say to us, you want to teach, and you guys have heard this because you've been in my classes all the time. It's like, and it's hanging on my office wall so that when I open the door and walk out, I am reminded of it. So not that I need to be reminded of it, but he would say, do you want to teach music to people, or do you want to teach people music? And that doesn't seem very profound until you start to say it more slowly. Do I want to teach music to people, or do I want to teach people music? And the second part of the statement prioritizes people over anything else. And I think when we begin to do that, we make decisions that are influential and long lasting, and are informed about the uh, particular things that help individuals, as opposed to I'm making this decision because it's the easiest for me. And so I think that at the center, if that's at the center of our teaching, then we almost can't go wrong. Now, that's another generalization, but I think you're headed in the right direction if you're developing relationships with human beings and then making your teaching decisions based on those uh, informed relationships, the informed things that you've learned from those relationships.
Yeah, and it's such a great, like a very important topic that like I think all educators should kind of like think about as like who they're teaching and what, depending on the subject and whatnot, and the whole idea we mentioned before, like care and like the ethic of how you run your classroom and how the students feel within that classroom, that space. But we are almost about at time to wrap up. Any remaining words from anybody about the topic or anything in general that we've
Well, I
talked
think,
about?
sorry, something that just occurred to me, particularly for anybody who's listening that is a pre-service teacher, like they're getting ready to go out into the world. One of the things that we try to work on a ton in teacher preparation, music teacher preparation programs, is getting you to the point where you're comfortable enough with your teacher self that you're not just thinking about your teacher self, that you're actually responding to what the students are doing. And I think that's a really difficult transition for some folks who are pre-service teachers. But the moment that you're able to move past, what am I saying? What am I doing? And how did that work? You should always be asking yourself those questions. But if you're able to move past it enough to be really concerned about what's going on with the students, if the question is not what did I say and what did I do, but how did what I said impact my students, that's even more important. And so, I don't know, something you just said made me think of that. But I think that doesn't just go for pre-service teachers. I think it could be for in-service teachers as well. But if we're stuck with only thinking inward about ourselves, then we're not really going to have that people music. It's going to be, I'm worried about me first and not the people kind of thing.
Mhm.
So anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think something that you've kind of hit on throughout this podcast and throughout the time that Jason and I have been in class with you is just the importance of respect and of really valuing each individual person, and just that I think Jason and I could both agree that that is definitely at the base of any effective and good interaction, especially any teaching interaction.
I'm glad that you know that. It warms my heart.
Yeah, and like even going off of that, like this idea of like reflection, like we do it a lot in class, and sometimes like I've heard people like talk about like, oh, we just have to write another assignment to just reflect on our teaching, watch our video, blah blah blah. And that's, I mean, granted, I have felt those in the moments of like I have so much work to do, I have to write it. But and I but with like a more like pure teaching environment, like I teach marching band every time I come back to I drive back home. I'll like sit down, like think about like what interactions have happened today, positive, negative, like how did I interact? Did I this if a situation occurred where I had to resolve it regarding like the music or like the how they were marching, did I address it in the right way, blah blah blah. And I'll give myself like a short list of like things like for next time, like, oh, if I had to fix something that I might have stated wrong at that moment, then I make sure that I bring it up so that we aren't practicing mistakes essentially. So that
Yeah,
whole
the idea of being reflective is so huge, and it can lead to the inclusivity for gender diversity, but it leads to good teaching too. I think, and we don't really, as in-service teachers, have the luxury of time always that we would want, that we do when our music education professor is forcing us to watch our TV. So at least you're developing the skill set of going like, okay, what did I do? How did it impact them? I think all that's really, really important to becoming a better teacher every single day.
All right. Well, if we have for done with our finishing thoughts, I want to thank Dr. Cates for joining us today and discussing these topics and the larger implications of gender inclusivity within language and also within the classroom. Because, like I said earlier in the podcast, it is a topic that needs more attention, but especially with like people who are knowledgeable about it, the knowledgeability is still kind of scarce. We're still in development within our present time, and I think pre-service music educators, since they are going to be essentially the future educators of music in within whatever they do, should be at least informed about these ideas so that going forwards we are always taking that step in the right direction to include more individuals within our classroom, which is and at the end all be all is we want more people to interact with us musically within what we do.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right, well, thank you
Thank you so much.
yeah, and for all our viewers, thank you for continuing supporting us and listening to us every other week. I don't know how our schedules work, but they're very valued, and we love the feedback that we're getting regarding these topics and the things that we discuss. But yeah, so this we will be signing off. So thank you again, and
Thank
have a great rest of your time, and stay safe. And Happy New Year's, because this is gonna probably come out on New Year's.
Woohoo.
All right.